I want to just mention a little bit about South Korea before wrapping up and hopefully getting some questions from you. As Grace mentioned, we published a study in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2011 based on a total population study. This was a study in which we looked at a high-risk and a low-risk group. The low-risk group being the kids who were in mainstream schools who had no record of any kind of special education, record, nothing. And no clinical assessments or special needs noted in their files. And the high-risk group was the children who were in special education programs or in schools for special needs. The high-risk group was immediately screened positive. We didn't even screen those. Those were sent for those names we included as our screen positive group. And then the others, we used screeners sent to both parents and to children looking for evidence that would make us count them as screen positive and then bring them to the stage for diagnostic confirmation. And what we found was a prevalence of 2.64%, the highest prevalence ever recorded in any study, as far as I know. There were many people who said, well, you know, you just found people that you thought looked autistic, or, you know, it's impossible. That's too high. Well, the reality is that as the Centers for Disease Control statistics become better, as they get more sources for reporting, they're coming up way up to this, for some states like New Jersey, to this level. And I suspect that if you were to do a total population study in a state in the United States, you would find that high a prevalence of autism, given the way we currently define autism. And we found that 2/3 of the children identified with autism had never been diagnosed, never received any clinical or educational service related to the symptoms of autism. So there were children who were in great need but undiagnosed. And to those people who criticized our study for saying that we perhaps diagnosed it where it didn't exist, or we found screen positives where that didn't exist, we didn't find screen positives. The parents and the teachers did. It was from the reports where these children were reported to have major challenges in areas of social communication, repetitive stereotype behaviors, and all of the basic things that we associate with the features of autism. Why were parents not having their kids taken care of? Why were teachers not alerting parents or others to the needs of these children? First of all, psychiatric care is highly stigmatizing. There are people in Seoul that I interviewed who fear their employers knowing that they have a child with a disability, who fear that the property values of their home will go down if people know that there's a child with a disability that lives there. Parents argued that autism is not a pervasive developmental disorder since their children were getting by in school with decent grades. Therefore, autism is a social issue, but it is not one that pervades other aspects of their child's life. And some of the parents whose children were diagnosed by a clinician with autism classified them, or the clinician classified the child, as having a tendency toward autism, which is an interesting way of putting it. It's sort of like we used to use PDD-NOS. Like, I don't want to give you this word autism because it's going to freak you out, but I'll give you PDD-NOS, which means sort of autism light, right? Which Asperger's became too, to some extent, right? A way of providing a term of autism that was less stigmatizing, and which, because of the decrease in stigma, I don't think we need Asperger's anymore. Did its job, right? Also, children in the age group that we studied, 7 to 12, were sitting in very highly routinized classrooms with lots of rote learning that kind of allowed children with milder functional impairments to sort of get by. So here are some excerpts from parents that I interviewed in Seoul. The doctor told me my son has a tendency toward autism. The difference between having autism and not having autism is just a few questions on a test. Oh, sorry, this is an actual dialogue. Women are there, and so Miok is responding to Eungyung. And then Miok says, so the test doesn't tell you anything. Here's another dialogue in which Eungyung says, but the mom should know if there's a tendency to autism. Hee-jung, my second son is 4 and he was diagnosed with a tendency to autism. So I went to another doctor and he said my child had a social disorder. My husband yelled at me. My husband and I had a big fight about it and I was just relieved that he didn't have autism. And then that husband who says our son is hardly different from other children. Eunju says, the biggest concern for me when my child entered elementary school was, will he blend in with his peers? I dreaded that he would stand out, that the kids and the teacher would discover something odd about him. There's a lot of fear in these statements, a lot of concern about what things mean. And in fact, just to go back to my slide before, you'll see that there in the third line of the second section, classified educable verbal children as border children. So the term border children was used to refer to, it was like a homegrown indigenous diagnosis that parents were using to talk about their children, that they didn't have autism, they were on the border. And you have to ask your question, what is so stigmatizing about autism as opposed to being on the border? And one issue for parents was that autism was increasingly conceived as a genetic disorder, and with genetics confounded with heredity. We know that genetics involves de novo mutations, that if everything was heredity, we'd be just much more like our parents. But we have lots of things that are different because of the thousands and thousands of mutations that occur to produce any individual. And in fact, evolution wouldn't work very well without de novo mutations. But if you fuse or confound heredity and genetics, then you see your child's issues as caused by your family. And in a sense, then, my child's autism is a commentary on the genetic value of my family and how will anybody want to marry into my family when they know we have damaged genes. As one result, and I've written about this elsewhere, women will take the bullet and say, look, I was just a bad mother. I caused this child's autism because of poor mothering. My other kids are fine. And this child doesn't have autism. He is either a border child or he has reactive attachment disorder. Those of you who are familiar with reactive attachment disorder know that one of the conditions for diagnosing this is that there has to be some evidence of abusive or pathological caretaking. And women will say, yes, I was a bad mother. In fact, Representative Shin, a member of the Korean National Assembly, is a psychiatrist who diagnosed many, many, many children at Yonsei University in Seoul with reactive attachment disorder, choosing to treat the mothers for mental illness rather than to treat the children. This is sort of a version, or perversion, if you will, if you want to place more of a value judgment on it, of the refrigerator mother hypothesis. So these are huge cultural issues involving stigma that one can get to, but you can only get to it if you listen to the parents. You can only get it if you think about how the quality of the experience of having a child with a disability is influenced by the particular time period and the community that the person is living in. Within all of this emphasis, in part one of my talk on construction of autism as a category, and in looking at some of the various ways in which we can approach cultural factors, we always have to, I think, come back and remember that both of these things, whether it's the scientific structure and clinical structure, or whether it's the ideas of the parents, will have an effect on the way in which people see themselves, and the way in which people identify themselves. If we think of autism in very stigmatizing and negative terms, our children with autism will grow up to feel that stigma.